You cannot collaborate with someone who has a different identity than you, who is exposed to other vulnerabilities that you are not exposed to, if you do not do some very, very deep anti-racism work. It is all so incredibly connected. If you're fundamentally still seeing your client as less than you because their skin tone, their education, their language, then you're always going to have a ceiling on what you can achieve when you're working with them.
Welcome to Impostrix Podcast, where we affirm the lived experiences of professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity at work. The tools that you learn here will help you confidently address racial toxicity at work, put that imposter syndrome to the side, stand in your power, and resist racial gaslighting. I'm your host, Whitney Knox-Lee, a Black mother to Black boy children, a civil rights attorney, and an anti-racism educator and trainer. If this is your first time listening, welcome. We're glad you're here. Episodes are published every week. Make sure you go back and listen to our past episodes. All right, here we go. Today, I am here with Lorilei Williams, who's going to tell us all about themselves. I look forward to this conversation because every time I talk to Lorilei, I just learn a lot. Like, Lorilei is one of those people where I'm like, can you teach me? Can you just be my teacher, like my life coach? Lorilei needs to be a life coach. Yes. But okay, so we're going to jump in. Hey, Lorilei, how are you doing?
Hi, what an introduction, man.
Yes, tell us about yourself.
My name is Lorilei. I use they, them pronouns. My identities are layered and multifaceted. I think one of the identities that I think about the most, but I think it's because of also the nature of politics and just social context right now, is the fact that I'm queer, trans, non-binary. I hold a lot of other identities that I think have sometimes been a little hidden to me when I've been doing the work as an immigration lawyer, which has also become part of my identity. But I also have an identity as a migrant. I didn't grow up in the U.S. I grew up in various different countries. And, as I get older, I realize how much of a difference that makes on my perspective on how I see the world, how I see social dynamics here in the U.S., because I have kind of come in as an outsider. And I think some other, aspects of my identity too are that I'm a wife. I'm a parent to a lot of fur babies. We've accumulated a little too, which is fantastic. And then I'm also the child of a Korean sex worker and a white American soldier. Which I think are also important to my identities because I understand conservatism in a way that is unique to those who grow up in the military-industrial complex. And I also understand both exploitation and how to get out of some of those cycles in ways that I think a lot of people don't necessarily have exposure because of my mother, because of the work that I've done. I would say those are kind of like the main identities that I think that I hold each day. And oftentimes when I try to introduce myself, when I do my presentations and public speaking and the like, I summarize all of that as artist, abolitionist, and attorney.
You are one of the first folks who I've had like deeper identity discussion with around military culture and how you came to be and reconciling harms that may have been done, ways that you experience privilege is just so complicated and complex. And I always just appreciate how when I'm talking to you, it's never the binary, the either or the good, bad. You're one of the people that stretched my mind around like cultural identity and ethnic identity and where we came from, like our individual selves, where we came from and what is our family history that we're coming into this world with. And so I've always really appreciated that about you. So thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate being able to discuss a lot of this with other people as well, because I think that when you grow up in the U.S. and you're mostly just exposed to American ways of viewing the world, it greatly impacts how you see yourself and how you discover your identities and how you walk through them, for sure.
Yeah. So one of the first things that I want to touch on is this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in our workplace. And I want to ask you specifically because one of the spaces where I got to know you in was as folks who do training and education to organizations around racial equity and how to encourage cultural humility. And so I'm interested from your perspective what this current iteration of DEI movement stuff, what is this all about, and is it important?
Yeah, it's such a big question. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately as well. I think very specifically about the spaces that I come from, which is the practice of immigration law. It's a space where trauma and trauma exposure is inherent within the work. Basically, we're trafficking in the stories of trauma of others, trying to figure out how we're going to craft it in a way that's going to sell it well with the government so we can actually get our client that relief that they're looking for. It feels like a very dirty business, and I think to some extent a lot of legal services for those of us who have been doing it a little bit longer, I think we all end up feeling a little gross because we see that not a lot of what we're actually doing is changing the systems that are creating the harm that we're fighting in the first place.
Absolutely.
And so we constantly feel like we're just putting a little Band-Aid over something and then it's all going to come crashing at some point. Now, I mention this because in my training and consulting work very specifically, I've been very intentional about marrying those topics of being trauma-informed and also DEI efforts, because I think DEI efforts in organizations where there might be a lot of trauma exposure, whether it be because of legal services or another industry, it is completely intertwined with the different forms of oppression we deal with within these systems, right? If we're trying to be trauma-informed and we completely ignore how systemic racism is impacting us as individuals, our organization, the efforts that we're trying to do, the actual impact we're trying to have on the communities that we're serving, you can't separate them. They are together. They have to be. I really started doing more training and consulting work in 2020, and I felt like there was such a strong interest. Everybody wanted a training, and everybody also had an opinion of what kind of training they wanted. And you could tell, at least in my practice, I could tell the organizations that seemed really committed and the ones that didn't. So organizations that absolutely had no budget to pay for my expertise, but yet wanted a ton of labor, they expect me to martyr myself because that is the practice in a lot of legal services. And so what I think is interesting now is I still see some interest in these trainings, but now it's organizations who've really built out that time and the budgeting, because it takes sometimes a couple of years to figure out a big budget through an organization. That restructuring, none of that is fast. And so now I think you're really seeing which organizations are really committed to that change and which ones aren't. And then I think where a lot of pain is coming for a lot of people, and perhaps a lot of surprise too, is we're really seeing which organizations were not committed to actual change. They did their trainings, they checked off their box, they signed up their staff for little yoga sessions or meditation sessions, and they said they did a great job and they patted themselves on the back. And then now all of their people are upset and frustrated, saying, well, why did you make us go through all of that if you're not actually going to change? But at the same time, the economy is terrible right now and jobs are scarce. A lot of people are getting laid off in different industries for different reasons. And I think that impacts the nonprofit industry just as much as it does anywhere else. And so how many of us are going to swallow things in order to keep a job, right? So it's a difficult place that we're in right now. I do think that there is still value in DEI work, but I think the value is not we do a training, now my people are trained and now we're going to do better. No. The value is here's where we can tell who's really invested in change, who is not, who's willing to get messy as we try to transform, who is not, and then we continue with the difficult work because it never gets easy.
Yeah, and it's never over, like it's never done. One of the things that I and my colleagues, when we're doing these trainings, try and impart on folks is that this is like a beginning. This isn't even the middle. This is the beginning when you're calling people in, when you're hiring people to come in and do these trainings. We're trying to establish like a foundation for you so that everyone can be relatively at the same place as we start to move forward and then have these conversations and make these changes and develop these initiatives and all of that stuff. It's certainly not a checkbox situation. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about trauma, because I wish that I knew Lorilei back in the day when I was having some very real trauma responses. It was before George Floyd, but it was after, I really can't remember who had been murdered. Someone had been murdered. It was a summer, and it got to the point of I didn't feel like I could go into work because I felt so threatened by just being Black, and felt as though I couldn't go into a space where I was pretending like I didn't feel that way, or like I was pretending like maybe our clients didn't feel this way. Because I don't know about other folks, but like when I was going to work, I was leaving all of what I considered the personal stuff or the non-work related stuff. So anything having to do with racial violence or anything having to do with stuff that affected me, but wasn't about my client today. I was leaving that all like in the car. And when I walked into work, I was trying to just be the attorney. And there was a very painful, clear day where that just wasn't possible. It just was not possible anymore. And I came into work and everybody could see it on my face that I wasn't feeling good. And I wound up just like talking, and it was like almost word vomit around like, this is happening to my people. This could be me. And you guys want me to come in and work? And then like you want me to go meet with other people, whether they're people of color or like very poor white folks who think that this is a political issue that my people are being killed, and want to make offhanded comments. And I just need something. I need somebody to say, okay, Whitney, yes, what you're experiencing is like totally valid. That is totally normal and it's real. And you're not being overly sensitive. And these are concerns that you should have. And you should want to talk with your clients or with your colleagues or with whoever about this experience. And I wish I would have known you back then, because I didn't know at the time that I was experiencing trauma and that my clients were experiencing trauma and trauma responses. And, if I called somebody and they didn't respond for weeks, and, I didn't know what was going on, but then they tell me later what's going on, and I'm realizing that they were experiencing something triggered them. And so talk to us about this. What is trauma-informed advocacy?
Yeah. Well, thank you for, I'm glad that my approach has been really helpful. There was a really great law review article in 2016 called The Pedagogy of Trauma-Informed Lawyering by Dia Halder and Sarah Katz. And I think that was like the first law review article that was published on trauma-informed lawyering, like ever, at least in the US.
Wow.
I couldn't really find much beyond that really talked about how do we do this in our work. And so, one thing that I know now that I didn't know earlier in my career is I'm someone who has been living with complex PTSD for most of my life.
Let me stop you real quick, because what is complex PTSD?
Complex PTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically I have trauma that is complex, not a single incident, but instead layers of things kind of compounding it's kind of like there's no beginning, middle, or end to the trauma. Instead, it just is a part of your life. It really shifts how you end up seeing the world. It shifts what you see as safe, as not safe, as appropriate behavior, as not appropriate behavior. In hindsight, that's how I learned that I think me becoming a lawyer was my ultimate safety plan. If I know all the laws, I know how to protect myself, then maybe I can stay safe that way. If I have access to higher income and more professional working experiences, maybe I can stay safe that way. Secret is it doesn't actually keep you safe. But because of that, because I'm someone who's been living with PTSD my whole life, my experience as a legal advocate, I think, has been very different from other people. So I've always known inherently that when I work with others as a lawyer, I am not a different class of human. And so that's meant that throughout my career, I've really kind of sought collaboration through my clients and support in working through them. And I've never relied on my organization or colleagues to give that to me, because it was my clients who I know that they could understand me and I could understand them in ways that my colleagues could never really understand me in that way, because they did not come from these migratory experiences. They didn't know or understand what it was like to go through moments of family separation, right? I had those experiences. And so when I think about trauma-informed lawyering, it really comes from a lot of that. And as I've done more research over the years, I realized that my personal experiences and my personal strategies were actually backed in science and backed in other things like organizational psychology, management science. And so trauma-informed lawyering is about really raising our own awareness of how does trauma impact us, our clients, our colleagues, in all the different ways that it can impact our world and how we connect with each other. Then it's about making sure that we're collaborating with others. This is where I see a lot of lawyers in particular fail. Anyone that has a lofty title is usually not great at collaboration. They're good at telling others what to do, not so great at really slowing down enough to be able to talk to each other and make sure you understand each other and that you are collaborating towards a goal together. And then it's about also making sure we're adapting strategically. And then finally, it's really thinking about how trauma is going to be very predictably showing up within our systems. It means within my own workflow, within my team's workflow, within my organization. So if I know it's going to come up, if I know that exposure is going to be constant, because that is in the very nature of the work that we do, how am I going to make sure that I'm protected, that my colleagues are protected, so we can still do the work well? Because I think what a lot of people do is they might be like, yes, trauma's everywhere. And instead of figuring out how to do better about dealing with that exposure, they just decide to work more, which brings them to burnout even faster. And so I do think that there are ways for us to do this work more sustainably, but so much of it also comes from you cannot collaborate with someone who has a different identity than you, who is exposed to other vulnerabilities that you are not exposed to, if you do not do some very, very deep anti-racism work. It is all so incredibly connected. If you're fundamentally still seeing your client as less than you because their skin tone, their education, their language, then you're always going to have a ceiling on what you can achieve when you're working with them.
Yeah. And the first thing that I'm thinking of is like this saviorism and how ingrained that is in our social services, our legal services, that like we are the almighty, blessed people who are coming in and saving these other folks. And it reminds me of colonialism and Manifest Destiny. And like, I'm the colonizer going to help out these indigenous folks whose culture and language and ways of being and values, basically, I just don't respect. Like, they're unfamiliar to me, so I don't respect them. And I love what you said about, like, we cannot collaborate with folks if we're unwilling to do the anti-racism work. We all have work to do. I have work to do. I absolutely have work to do. And for me, it's all about finding the commonalities And that might mean not even getting to the work part of it. And I think too, when I'm thinking about organizations and like these partnerships that we have as organizations, like a partnership with local NAACP or the local whoever it is, where the only part of the partnership is that I'm taking their name and putting it on my flyer, where there's no actual relationship or relationship building. That's what when you said collaboration, I wrote down partnership, because I think we have so much work to do to create actual partnerships that can actually be impactful for the communities that we're working with, and the communities that we're living with. Because the other thing for me is that this work that I do is almost like self-preservation relating, in that I see myself there. Like I can see myself in jails and prisons, because I'm not perfect, because I've broken some laws now. I just happen to not get caught. I can see my children there. I can see my husband in these situations. And so I always try and keep the perspective like, this is my community. I haven't had that experience, and never want to like put myself in a position where I'm speaking for somebody or a group of people who are having a completely different experience than I am. But for me, it's a personal endeavor, effort, advocacy, life, that I lead. And I think talking about trauma and how trauma impacts the way that I'm able to show up, both in work towards my colleagues, but also towards the people that we serve and the people that we collaborate with, I think is just so important. So what are things that we can do? Like, how do we know when trauma is coming up for us?
Ooh, I mean, to some extent, depending on what kind of work we do, what our lives are like, we should maybe just assume always. At least
if you're an immigration attorney, every day, all the time.
Yeah, if you're an immigration attorney, if you work in prisons and jails, if you do any type of family separation, family detention work, like I'm really using those terms very, very broadly, right? I'm mindful that the beginnings of family separation happened with indigenous people in boarding schools and with slaves and separating children from their parents, So in any case, I think that there are really great frameworks out there that are really helpful when I have trainings that I do where I really try to teach people the skills. And a lot of it is about communication, creating that space, that mindfulness, figuring out how to identify our own emotions, not mixing up our emotions with that of others. I know one of the things that drives me insane, mainly because as a trauma survivor, people have done it to me. So it drives me crazy when I see others do it to others. But if I tell someone something super traumatic and your reaction is to get teary-eyed and like just to start kind of use pitying language and things like that, that just, it turns me off even more as someone as a trauma survivor. I feel like I can't be seen. And I think that within the helping professions, we do that a lot, right? Our heart just breaks all the time. And to some extent, like that is valid, but it's so important to understand emotion and mindfulness, because what a lot of times we're doing that we don't know that we're doing is we're imposing our own emotion onto the person we're talking to. So if someone's sharing a really traumatic experience and we're reacting with all that frustration, grief, overwhelm, we might be thinking, oh, it's because that's how they must feel because they went through that. But that could be robbing them of what their experience is, because they might feel a totally different way. And so that's the fundamental skill that we have to work on when we want to be more trauma informed, is really understand how to listen, how to communicate, how to navigate our own emotions, and how to create space for others to share and navigate their emotions. Understanding that it is not possible for us to know what someone else is feeling without asking. We must always ask, because our emotions are impacted by our experiences, by our individual biology, by our individual connection to community, by our own life experiences. And so we cannot presume to know that. And then I think the other thing that's a big part of being trauma informed is getting away from this black and white binary of, you harmed me, I'm hurt, you must rectify that harm. As someone who has very personal experiences with violence, it's always true that hurt people hurt people. But that saying does not go deep enough to tell us how to navigate that. And for me, what's really telling when I think about some of the more recent incidents of violence that I experienced in my personal life was from someone who I gave a lot of grace to because of how much violence they had experienced. So much grace that to some extent I gave them some permission to expose me to their own violence because they did not know how to regulate their own emotions. And they felt like it was other people's responsibility to accommodate them because of what they'd been through. But I think the reality is that each one of us may have gone through things that others have no way of knowing. And so if we operate in this kind of almost like oppression Olympics type situation where it's like whoever suffered the most gets to get away with how they're reacting the most, then we're never going to heal and move forward with things. And it's going to just exacerbate a lot of harms. So there's a lot of other frameworks. So there's one that I used from the Conflict Resolution Playbook by Jeremy Pollack, where instead of thinking about who harms and who is harmed, think about who's triggered and who is triggering, right? And this really resonates with me as a trauma survivor because think about this more in my personal relationships, but because of bad relationships I've had in the past, with my current husband, I might have been like just very jumpy about certain things, just assuming the worst interpretation, getting upset before I had any reason to get upset, right? Now, is that his fault that I went through all those bad relationships that caused me to react that way? It's not his fault. Is it my fault necessarily that I have those trauma responses? It's only my fault if I choose to not recognize them and I choose to not try to heal from them, right? Because that is my responsibility. Then it's about thinking about that in the work context, because those race conversations trigger a lot of things like this. And so it's really, really hard to navigate these conversations because at the end of the day, that doesn't matter if you're white or a person of color, we can each repeat harmful white dominant mental models and hurt each other. And so it is a question of how do we get back to better communication skills, get away from blame and shame, and really focus on understanding each other, excuse me, and connecting through some of those trigger responses.
Yeah, I like bringing it down to the basic of like, how can we listen in a way that allows space?
I think that having these conversations is important kind of for like the reason you just mentioned. We're not in the situation that our clients are in. This is how we can go through some of the impacts that are going on us. But that doesn't mean we need to live here, right? We don't need to live in this conversation 24/7 because that also is not helpful. And I think that's where I see some of the trickiest issues happen right now, because there may be managers, for example, who are trying to lead teams doing very, very difficult work. And maybe they're trying to come from a very heart-centric place, trying to come from a very trauma-informed place. So they're always ready and available to have those conversations. But yet, maybe because they're having all those conversations, there's no actual structure in the workplace.
Okay.
And maybe case assignments aren't clear. Maybe caseloads aren't checked to make sure they're sustainable. Supports for staff, double checks within systems are not employed. And so every day, feels like everything's on fire. And at the same time, it feels like all we're doing is talking about how hot the fire is and how much it hurts, instead of shifting the conversation to how do we get some water? How do we put this out? How do we prevent this from getting this bad in the future? Because we're always playing with fire in this work, you know? And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that when we're actually talking about nitty-gritty solutions to workflow that help with units that are over capacity and burnt out, there has to be structure. There has to be professionalism. There has to be boundaries. There has to be plans. There has to be clarity and resources, capacity, all of that. And that does not look sexy. Whether or not your case management system works for you and everyone's putting their notes in on time, how cases flow from reception to intake to the unit giving services, all of those things matter. Because a system that doesn't exist, for example, would be one where we see it a lot of nonprofits where every attorney feels like a solo practitioner. And what does that then create? It creates an experience for the advocates within that unit where they feel like they're alone, like they have to confront all these problems by themselves. When they bring it up to their manager is like, oh, I'm so sorry. Have you used your flex time yet? That does not solve the problem. You cannot throw money at the problem. You cannot just give people PTO and benefits and expect the problem to be resolved. You have to actually think about how you're executing your work. What I see is a focus on intent and a lack of accountability to impact. We're going to have all these conversations about how trauma is impacting us and talk about what our staff need to do the work. And we're going to create more sick time and vacation time and get you some more benefits and give you more salary. But we're never actually going to change the impact that we have on the very communities that we're serving because we're not doing the work differently. That's harmful to those of us who actually see those patterns. And those of us who have been doing the work for quite a while. I know a number of folks who have burnt out from the nonprofit industrial complex because we are tired of working in systems that keep the systems alive and don't do enough to challenge it within our capacity using resources we know are available, right? I am not saying that we need to be filing every single impact litigation suit, but thinking about your capacity is not about, oh, I'm saying no because I don't want to help the community. It's about, I'm saying no because I am working within my own competence, doing my own due diligence, and I don't want to cause harm to the community by taking on more than I can chew. And I don't think we do enough to think about that accountability.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right there. You had mentioned it earlier on, the martyrdom. And that is what's expected in a lot of these professions, these helping professions, is that we are literally going to work until we keel over out of sickness or mental health issues or substance abuse and addiction or whatever the case may be. Like, it's this feeling of, well, this is the work that you signed up for. You're going to give your everything to this cause and, you know, deal with it. And take your 2 weeks off, but then come back and go right back into the thing. It's also this binary again of like, either I want to be a martyr or I just don't care about the work that I'm doing. It can't be both. And so I think that's where, when you were saying it can get offensive, these conversations get really heated because I think that's what it looks like for a lot of people is, well, Whitney, you're saying that, you know, this is too much work, but this is what you signed up for, and so you must not care. And if you cared, then we would all just do everything that we could possibly do. And everything that we could possibly do means spending 75% of our waking hours, you know, doing this work. And it's, for me, that's not sustainable. For me, that's what creates feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression, feelings of irritability, being detached emotionally from my family and from my friends, all of those things. What are things that you do to care for yourself so that when you are working with these communities, you're not bringing your trauma to them?
Yeah, I think the main thing is just always being mindful and open with communication. I think with clients in particular, to some extent, it is helpful when I bring a bit more of my baggage to the table, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Still maintaining professional boundaries. But I think what I'm really sitting with too is how you're talking about wanting to find a way to do this work sustainably. I think that when you do end up a lot of times speaking up in the workspace and are a bit of a martyr, you do end up sacrificing yourself a bit for the work. It's very important to remember that the work continues without you and it doesn't sacrifice back. I feel like I have kind of sacrificed an extreme amount of my life for the work that I do. And now I'm in a situation that I think is very similar to a lot of people who leave organizations for complex reasons, where I'm piecemealing work from different places to try to make full-time income happen, right? Mm-hmm. And so I share that because when we're talking about what am I doing right now to kind of create sustainability, is a very challenging question, because it's also to me about thinking about how can I work towards a lifestyle that lets me live my values, that creates days where I am proud of the energy I have expended that day doing whatever it is that I've done, where I'm not terrified if I'm going to make rent or have enough money for medical bills or for food, right? Mm-hmm. That is the sustainability that I want, that I think a lot of times we forget sometimes in these spaces where we've also worked to get much higher salaries for nonprofit workers. Mm-hmm. And so sustainability looks like that, like creating a life that you are proud to live, that meets your needs and gives you some space to have joy. For me, I'm still figuring that out when it comes to work. And being creative about that is thinking about how do I design a life that can be supported and follows the values that I really live. Mm-hmm. And so in any case, labor rights are very important for sustainability, mm-hmm. workplace rights, all of those. And then I think art in particular for me has been a huge important thing for my own sustainability. I have some of my art pieces in my office as a background on my Zoom, and a lot of it, similar to the word vomit you described before, I call it heart vomit. All of my art is heart vomit because it's something that happened in my work or in exploration of my own intergenerational trauma, or something that then triggered a piece to come out.
Thank you for sharing that. I am so grateful for the time that you've spent with us today, Lorilei. Thank you so much. I think the things that I want to leave people thinking about for this upcoming week is really thinking about mindfulness in the spaces that you are working within, how we can better listen to the folks that we are working with and create space for them, and then also create sustainability for us in our work. Thank you again, Lorilei, for being here. Can you share with us how folks can find you if they want to learn more about trauma-informed lawyering? I know you were doing trainings. I don't know if you're still doing trainings. But let us know where we can find you.
Yeah, I'm trying to create some more space to do more trainings again, but people can find me, my website, Lorilei, LORILEI.info. And then on almost all the social media, I am at Lorilei Williams, LORILEI. So yeah, it's been such a pleasure talking to you about all of this. It's always such a pleasure talking to you about anything. I'm just really excited about this podcast and all the conversations that you're having.
Oh yeah. It's been great. It's been really transformative for me. And so if this is your first episode listening to Lorilei and I, welcome, and, go back and listen to some of the other episodes because it's great stuff. All right, Lorilei, thank you.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on today's show. If you enjoyed the show today, don't forget to leave me your feedback, write me a review, rate the show, and share with your community. I would love to hear from you. You can find all of my contact information, and you can find ways to support the show by donating or purchasing merchandise directly on my website, www.impostrixpodcast.com. Until next time, be validated.